The hearthstone had always been there, solid and gray and indifferent, anchoring the center of the ranch house like a secret that had been waiting patiently for the right moment to detonate. Hazel Wallace found it on a Tuesday in October of 1882, when she was down on her knees scrubbing soot from the base of the fireplace, while Gideon Maddox was out riding the south fence line. She had been at the Maddox ranch for 6 weeks by then, hired on as a housekeeper after answering an advertisement posted at the general store in Cutter's Creek, Wyoming territory. 6 weeks of quiet mornings and careful distances, and a man who watched her from across rooms like he was trying to solve something he had given up believing could ever be solved. She was scrubbing, and her brush caught the edge of a groove in the stone, and she pulled back and looked down, and there they were. 2 sets of initials, carved deep into the lower left corner of the hearthstone where the mortar met the floor. Not scratched lightly by idle hands but cut with deliberate pressure, the kind of mark that takes time and intention. A knife or a chisel, someone who wanted it to last, G.M. and E.M. Gideon Maddox, and someone whose first name began with E. Someone who had shared his last name. Hazel sat back on her heels and the scrub brush fell from her fingers and knocked against the stone floor, and the sound of it echoed through the empty house like a small, sharp accusation. She pressed one hand flat against the hearthstone and felt the grooves with her fingertips. They were worn smooth at the edges. Old. These letters had been here for years, touched by firelight through every season that had passed over this land. She did not hear the front door open. She did not hear his boots on the floor, but she heard him stop. She heard the exact moment Gideon Maddox went perfectly, terribly still. She turned and looked up at him from the floor, her hand still flat against that stone, and the look on his face broke something loose inside her chest that she had not known was attached to anything at all. He was standing in the doorway with his hat in his hands and his jaw locked tight and his dark eyes fixed on her fingers resting over those initials, and the color had drained from his face the way color drains when something has gone past pain and arrived somewhere older and quieter and far more dangerous. Gideon, she said, just his name. That was all. He crossed the room in 4 strides and crouched down beside her, and for one suspended moment she thought he was going to reach out and cover the initials with his hand, cover them like he could take them back. But he did not. He looked at them. He looked at them like a man looking at a wound he has been carrying so long he had almost forgotten what the original flesh looked like. "Eleanor," he said finally. His voice came out stripped of everything that usually lived in it. Stripped of the authority she had heard him use with his ranch hands, stripped of the careful politeness he directed at her, stripped of the long silences he wore like armor. Her name was Eleanor Maddox. She was my wife. Hazel Wallace felt those words land in the hollow of her sternum. "Was," she said quietly. "She died." He set his hat down on the floor beside him, and she had never seen him set his hat down anywhere except a hook or a table, and somehow that small, careless gesture told her more than anything else could have. 3 years ago this coming November, she died in this house. He straightened then and stood, and he did not look at Hazel, and he walked to the window and braced one hand on the frame and looked out at the land that spread away from the house in every direction like it was trying to get as far from something as it possibly could. "I should have told you," he said. "Before you came here, before you took this position, I should have told you there were things in this house that belonged to someone else." Hazel got to her feet slowly. She dusted her hands against her apron. Outside, the wind was moving through the tall grass of the eastern pasture, and it sounded like breathing, slow and steady and completely without mercy. "Tell me now," she said, and he did. But to understand what Gideon Maddox told her that afternoon in October of 1882, you have to understand what brought Hazel Wallace to Cutter's Creek in the first place. You have to go back to the beginning of things, which is never quite where you expect it to be. Hazel had come west from Cincinnati in August of that year, 26 years old and carrying nothing but a canvas trunk, a box of her mother's sewing supplies, and a particular brand of desperation. She had grown very skilled at hiding behind a composed expression, and a habit of keeping her chin slightly lifted. Her father had died the previous winter, leaving behind nothing but debt and a name that no longer carried any of the weight it once had. Her older brother had married a woman with opinions about who belonged in whose house, and those opinions did not include Hazel. She had been engaged once to a man named Reginald Hooper, who sold insurance and wore his hair parted very precisely down the center, and told her in the spring of that year that he was sorry, but he needed someone more settled, someone with family money or at least family prospects, and he said it in the careful voice people use when they are trying to make a cruel thing sound reasonable. So Hazel Wallace came west because she had a cousin in Denver who had said vaguely that there was opportunity out there for a woman who was not afraid of hard work. She arrived in Denver to find that her cousin had moved on to San Francisco 3 months prior, leaving only a forwarding address and no particular guilt about it. Hazel had just enough money to make a choice, and the choice she made was to look at the employment listings tacked to the board at the train station and keep moving until she found something that felt like solid ground. The listing for Cutter's Creek had read, in straight plain handwriting, "Housekeeper needed at Maddox Ranch, 4 miles north of Cutter's Creek, Wyoming Territory. Room and board provided plus wages of $12 per month. Must be capable and discreet. Inquire with Thomas Briggs at the general store. Capable and discreet." She had read those words and thought, yes, those were words that applied to her. She had been capable and discreet all her life, and if there was a place in the world that needed those things, she was willing to go there. She took the stage north to Cutter's Creek, arrived on a Wednesday afternoon, and walked into the general store where Thomas Briggs was the proprietor, a round and pleasant man of 50, who looked her over with the frank assessment of someone accustomed to reading people quickly, and said that Gideon Maddox would be by for supplies on Friday and she could wait or she could wait, those being her two options. She waited. Gideon Maddox came into the general store on Friday morning, and the first thing Hazel noticed about him was his hands. He set a list down on the counter, and they were broad and scarred and careful, those hands, the hands of someone who had built things and fixed things and possibly broken things, and had tried to be honest about all three. He was 34 years old, tall, with dark hair going gray at the temples in a way that looked like he had earned it honestly, and dark brown eyes that swept the room in a single efficient assessment before settling on her. "Miss Wallace," he said. "Mr. Maddox," she said, and she stood up from the chair by the window where she had been sitting for 2 days, and she held out her hand. He shook it. His grip was firm, and he let go quickly, and he looked at her with an expression she could not entirely read. "Thomas says you're looking for work," he said. "I am. You have references." She handed him the 2 letters she had brought. A former employer in Cincinnati, a Mrs. Dowd who had employed her as a seamstress for 3 years, a letter from her father's old business partner attesting to her character. Gideon read them both while standing at the counter, and she watched his eyes move across the page, and she noticed that he read carefully, the way people read when they are actually absorbing words rather than performing the act of reading. He folded the letters and handed them back. "It's a working ranch," he said. "I have 6 hands employed. The house is large. I'm not easy company." "I am not looking for easy company," Hazel said. "I am looking for work." Something moved briefly across his face. Not quite a smile, but something in that neighborhood. "Fair enough," he said. "Can you start Monday?" She could start Monday. The Maddox Ranch was everything the Wyoming Territory could offer in the way of landscape, which was considerable, and which had the quality of beauty that does not ask your permission before it affects you. The house was a 2-story structure of timber and stone, built solid and built to last, with a porch that ran along the front and a kitchen that had clearly been designed by someone who understood how cold Wyoming winters became. The barn was large. The bunkhouse for the hands was well maintained, and the land itself rolled out in every direction under a sky that was so blue it seemed almost aggressive about it. Hazel settled in with the efficiency she always brought to new circumstances. She learned the kitchen within a week, learned the rhythms of the ranch within 2, and learned the particular rhythms of Gideon Maddox within 4, which was a longer project, and one she was not entirely sure she had completed even after 6 weeks. He was a contained man. Not unfriendly, but contained, the way a dam is contained, something working hard to hold a shape around pressure. He was up before dawn every morning, out with his horses and his cattle and his fences and his land. He came in for meals and he ate well, and he thanked her for the cooking in plain, sincere terms that were neither effusive nor perfunctory. He paid her wages on the 1st of each month, exact and on time. He did not drink. He was kind to his ranch hands, a group of men who clearly respected him in the particular way that respect grows when it has not been demanded but has been earned. He read in the evenings, mostly, seated at the desk in his study with a lamp burning, and sometimes she caught the titles of the books and they surprised her. Poetry, history, a dog-eared volume of Shakespeare that had been read so many times the spine was repaired with carpenter's tape. He did not talk about himself. He answered questions about the ranch, about her duties, about practical matters with directness and clarity. But any question that veered toward the personal was met with a polite and seamless redirection that was so smooth she sometimes did not notice she had been redirected until she was already several subjects away from where she started. He had no photographs on his walls. She noticed that. The house had the lived-in quality of a place that had been genuinely inhabited rather than merely occupied, but there was a stripped quality to certain surfaces, the mantel over the fireplace bare of decoration, the shelves in the parlor holding only books, the kind of emptiness that comes not from neglect but from deliberate clearing. She did not ask about it. Capable and discreet. She had promised both and she delivered both. And she told herself that a man's private sorrows were his own business and not hers. But the Hearthstone had other ideas. So there she stood, in the October afternoon light, while Gideon Maddox stood at the window with his hand on the frame, and the whole enormous story of Eleanor Maddox began to pour out of him like water through a break in a wall that has been holding too long. Eleanor had come to the ranch in 1876, he said. She had come with her family, who had been homesteaders working a claim about 12 miles to the east, and there had been a dispute over water rights that had been a common and ugly story in that territory in those years, and her family had been forced off their land by a combination of legal manipulation and the kind of pressure that involves men on horseback at inconvenient hours. Eleanor's father had come to Gideon because Gideon had the most established presence in the area and some influence with the land office in Cheyenne. And Eleanor had come with her father to interpret because her father was German-born, and his English became uncertain under stress. She walked in through that door, Gideon said, gesturing to the front door without turning from the window, and she just looked around the room like she was calculating something. Not the way people look when they're impressed, more like she was looking for what needed to be done and estimating how long it would take. And I thought, this person knows how to look at a problem. He had been 27 years old. He had owned the ranch for 2 years by then, having purchased it with money saved from a decade of working other men's cattle from Texas to Montana. He had built it methodically, carefully, with a long-term vision that his ranch hands found both impressive and faintly exhausting. He had not, up to that point, given particular thought to marriage, not because he was opposed to it, but because he had been too occupied with building to examine what he might be building toward. Eleanor was 23 and fearless in the particular way that people become fearless when they have already lost the things they were afraid of losing. She helped her father navigate the land dispute, and Gideon used his contacts in Cheyenne to get the homestead claim reviewed. And while that process unfolded over 4 months, Eleanor came to the ranch 3 times with her father. And by the end of the 4th month, Gideon had asked her to walk with him one evening along the creek that ran at the bottom of the south pasture, and he had told her plainly that he would like to know her better, and she had told him, equally plainly, that she did not see why not. They were married in May of 1877 in the Methodist Church in Cutter's Creek. The homestead dispute was eventually resolved partially in Alina's family's favor, a partial victory that was better than nothing and good enough to allow her parents to relocate to a different claim further north. Alina stayed on the Maddox ranch. She was the one who carved those initials, Gideon said. We'd been married about 6 months. I came in one evening and found her down on the floor next to the fireplace with a chisel, and I asked her what in the world she thought she was doing, and she said she was making sure the house knew we lived in it. There was a long silence. Outside, a horse called from the direction of the barn, a long throaty sound that carried in the thin autumn air. She sounds like someone who knew her own mind, Hazel said carefully. She knew her own mind better than anyone I have ever met, he said. Better than she knew her own body, as it turned out. He turned from the window then, and for the first time since he began talking, he looked directly at Hazel. And what she saw in his face was not the grief she had been expecting, not the wet, devastated look of fresh loss, but something older and harder to name, the look of someone who has had years to press loss into a shape that does not destroy them every time they breathe. She was sick, he said. She had been sick before she came here, though she did not know it, or at least she did not know what it was. She had always been thin, always had trouble in the cold months. The doctors, such as they were in Cutter's Creek in those years, said different things at different times. The doctor in Cheyenne, when we finally made the trip in the autumn of 1879, said tuberculosis. He said probably she had been carrying it for years. He said the Wyoming climate was one of the better ones for managing it, dry and cold, but that she would need rest and that certain seasons would be harder than others. Alina had lived with this diagnosis for 2 years. She had managed it in her characteristic way, which was to treat it as a logistical problem to be solved rather than a tragedy to be mourned. She continued to run the household with the same capable efficiency she had always brought to everything. She continued to ride, though less frequently and only in the mild seasons. She made Gideon promise not to tell the ranch hands because she did not want them treating her differently. I kept that promise, he said, longer than I should have. I kept too many things to myself in those years. I thought if I didn't say them out loud, they might not be as real as I was afraid they were. The winter of 1881 to 1882 had been brutal across Wyoming territory, one of the killing winters that ranchers in that region remembered for the rest of their lives. The cold came early and stayed late, and came back again when it seemed like it might be releasing. Alina had gone through that winter with a declining resilience that Gideon had watched with a terror he had nowhere to put. By March she was confined mostly to the bedroom. By October of 1882, exactly 3 years before the moment Hazel was standing in his parlor listening to this story, Alina Maddox had been dead for a year and a month. The house had been empty of its particular kind of warmth for a year and a month. Hazel stood very still through all of this, listening with the complete attention she had always been capable of, the attention that was one of her genuine gifts, the ability to hear not just words but the weight of them. She had not known, when she answered that advertisement, that she was walking into a house still full of someone else's presence. She had not known that the bare mantel and the cleared shelves were the topography of a specific grief. She had not known that the contained, careful man who thanked her for his meals with plain sincerity was thanking her partly because the simplest domestic comforts had become unbearable markers of everything he had lost. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked when he had finished. "When you hired me, you must have known I would eventually find out. This is not a large town. People talk. People in Cutter's Creek know not to push their way into my business," he said, with a brief return of the quiet authority she was accustomed to hearing from him. And I did not tell you because I could not find the words that did not make it sound like I was asking you to walk into a haunted house and calling it a job." "It is not a haunted house," Hazel said. He looked at her. "It is a house where someone lived and loved and died," she said. "That is true of most houses that have been standing long enough. It does not make it haunted, it makes it real." He held her gaze for a moment, and she saw something shift in those dark eyes, some small tectonic adjustment in the way he was holding himself. "I have not been entirely honest with you," he said. "There is more." She waited. He walked to the desk in the corner of the room and opened the bottom drawer and took out a folded piece of paper. He held it for a moment, not opening it, just held it the way you hold something that has been both a comfort and a torment for so long that you are no longer entirely sure which it is more. "Eleanor left me a letter," he said. "She wrote it in the last weeks. She was still lucid, still herself, just." He stopped, corrected. "She knew what was coming. She wrote things she wanted me to know. And she wrote one thing that I have been, in some part of my mind, arguing with for an entire year." He looked at the folded paper. "She told me not to be alone. She said she could not bear the thought of this house being empty of life. She said I had the capacity to be someone's home. That was how she put it, and she said that she wanted me to use it." Hazel did not say anything. "I put out that advertisement," Gideon said, "because I could not manage this house and the ranch both. That part is true. But it is also true that when I wrote the words capable and discreet, I was thinking about her. About the way she had walked into this room that first time and looked at what needed to be done." He finally set the paper down on the desk. "I was not looking for a housekeeper. Or rather, I was, but I think I was also looking for proof that it was still possible for this house to have someone alive in it." "Gideon," Hazel said, and his name in her mouth had changed somehow over the course of this conversation, had become less formal, less the name of an employer and more the name of a person. "That is an enormous weight to have been carrying alone." "I know," he said simply. She crossed the room. She stopped about 3 feet from him, which was still a professional distance, still the distance of someone who understood her position and respected the boundaries of it, but she looked at him directly and steadily. "I am sorry about Eleanor. I am genuinely sorry. She sounds like someone extraordinary." "She was," he said, "and I am glad that you told me, even if it took a chisel mark in a Hearthstone to get there." The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite that smile again, but closer than it had been the first time. "Eleanor would have found that appropriately ironic," he said. "She always said the house would tell its own story eventually." Hazel went back to the hearth. She picked up her scrub brush. She looked at the initials one more time, GM and EM, worn smooth at the edges, and she felt with a clarity that surprised her not jealousy, not displacement, but something more like reverence. For the woman who had pressed a chisel into this stone and said, firmly and permanently, "We lived here, we existed here, this was real." "I am going to clean around them," Hazel said, "but I am not going to clean them away." She heard him exhale behind her. It was the sound of a man who has been holding something underwater for a very long time finally letting it surface. "Thank you," he said, in that plain and sincere voice of his. And then he picked up his hat from the floor where he had set it down so carelessly, and he walked back out through the front door. And Hazel listened to his boots on the porch, and then fading across the yard. And she looked at those 2 sets of initials in the stone, and she thought about what it meant to make a mark that outlasted you. And she thought about what kind of man kept a chisel mark clean for 3 years instead of filling it in with mortar and moving forward. And she thought that she might be in very serious trouble. That was October. November brought the first hard frost, and with it a change in the rhythms of the ranch that pressed Hazel and Gideon closer together in the practical geography of the house. The ranch hands, 6 of them, were occupied with preparing the cattle for winter, bringing the herd to the lower pastures, checking the hay stores, reinforcing the barn. This meant Gideon was often working from the barn or the corrals rather than riding the far reaches of his land, which meant he was closer to the house, which meant he came in for lunch rather than eating in the field, and the two of them sat across from each other at the kitchen table in the middle of the day more days than not. He started talking. Not about Alina, not at first, but about other things. The history of the ranch, the particular difficulties of running cattle through Wyoming winters, the politics of the Wyoming territory which were in those years in a state of considerable volatility, as the question of statehood and the question of cattle-baron power were beginning to grind together in ways that would eventually produce events that Hazel would read about in the papers years later with a particular and personal understanding of their roots. She talked back. That was perhaps what surprised him. She could see it in the slight adjustment of his expression the first time she offered a counterargument about land policy, a genuine counterargument based on something she had read. She was not a woman who performed agreement for the comfort of the men in the room. She had opinions, and they were formed opinions, and she was willing to defend them. She had learned in Cincinnati that this quality was considered, in women, a liability. She had stopped apologizing for it somewhere in the long and uncomfortable process of watching her life disassemble. He did not want her to be quiet. She could see that. He engaged with her arguments, pushed back on them, modified his positions when she made a point he could not answer, and held his ground when he believed he was right. They had, across the kitchen table in November, the best conversations Hazel could remember having with anyone since her father had been alive, and they had stayed up late on winter evenings in Cincinnati debating the events of the day with the radio of their minds tuned to whatever was interesting and urgent. The ranch hands noticed. She caught them watching sometimes, from the barn or the yard, watching the two figures visible through the kitchen window, talking over coffee while the frost settled on the porch boards. One of the hands, a young man of 22 named Cal Denton, who was cheerful and entirely without guile, told her one afternoon when she brought lunch out to the barn that Mr. Maddox had not sat down to a proper midday meal at the house in the 18 months Cal had been working there. She received this information with a composed expression and said something neutral and tucked it away in the part of her mind where she kept things that required careful thinking. She was careful. She was very careful. Because the feeling growing in her chest was something she had not asked for and did not entirely trust, and she had reasons not to trust it that went beyond reasonable caution. She had been careful about Reginald Hooper, or she had thought she was careful, and that had ended in the particular humiliation of being found insufficient in a way she could still feel in cold weather. She was in this man's house as an employee. She was here because she had needed a position and he had needed a housekeeper, and the symmetry of that arrangement had nothing romantic about it. The fact that he was beginning to look at her across the kitchen table with something in his eyes that made her think of those initials carved into the stone, two people wanting to leave a permanent mark on something, that fact was something she was doing her very best to approach rationally. She was not entirely succeeding. The first truly revealing moment came in the third week of November, on an evening when a storm came down from the north fast, and without the warning the sky usually offered, dropping temperature and visibility simultaneously. Gideon was still out at the barn, securing the horses when the full force of it hit, and Hazel stood at the front window, watching the snow come horizontal, and feeling a specific fear that she recognized as disproportionate and therefore significant. She was afraid for him. Not in the abstract way you are afraid for someone in a dangerous situation, but in the particular way that means you have already given that person's well-being a weight in your heart that you did not consciously authorize. He came in 40 minutes later, covered in snow, his coat frozen at the collar, and she had hot coffee and a dry towel and a look on her face that she immediately tried to neutral out. But she was not quite fast enough, and he saw it. He stood in the kitchen doorway dripping on the floor she had scrubbed that morning, and he looked at her with that long, careful look of his, the one that seemed to be reading several things at once. "Storm came fast," he said. "I could see that," she said, handing him the towel. "Were you worried?" "Of course I was worried," she said, because she had decided some years ago that direct honesty was the only sustainable policy. You were outside in a blizzard. He took the towel and looked at her over it while he dried his face, and there was something in his eyes that was warm in a way that had nothing to do with the stove she had stoked behind her. "I've been doing this for 15 years, he said. "I am aware that your experience predates my concern," she said, with a composure she was rather proud of. "That does not mean the concern is unreasonable." He sat down. She poured him coffee and he wrapped both hands around the cup and he said quietly, "Alina used to watch for me in storms." "I know," Hazel said. She did not know how she knew, but she did. The house had told her. They sat in the kitchen, while the storm pressed at the windows and the stove threw its warmth into the room. And they talked for 3 hours, the longest continuous conversation they had had, ranging from ranch matters to their respective histories, to a long digression about a novel they had both apparently read. A thing that delighted her so genuinely that she laughed. And the sound of her own laugh in that house surprised her almost as much as the look on Gideon Maddox's face when he heard it. Like he had forgotten that sound existed, like he was remembering something essential. December came. The ranch entered its winter rhythms, slower and colder and more interior. The cattle were down in the lower pastures, the hands' work shifted to maintenance and preparation, and the house became more fully occupied by the 2 people in it. Hazel baked bread because bread required attention, and attention kept her mind from going places she was not sure she should let it go. Gideon spent more evenings in the parlor rather than the study, the parlor being where Hazel usually sat in the evenings with her sewing or her own reading, and he brought his books with him and they read in companionable quiet, occasionally sharing passages across the room. On the 14th of December, he asked her about her family. She told him. Not as she usually told it, the abbreviated and carefully edited version she offered to casual acquaintance, but the actual version, the father she had admired, and the mother who had died when Hazel was 14, and the brother who had chosen domestic peace over loyalty, and the fiancé who had found her insufficient, and the specific kind of loneliness that comes from being someone with capacity and intelligence who has had no adequate container for either. He listened with the same complete attention she offered him, which she recognized as one of the most intimate things 2 people can give each other, the actual gift of being truly heard. "You left because there was nothing left to stay for," he said when she had finished. "I left because staying had become a smaller life than I was capable of living," she said. "There is a difference." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind moved over the snow that had accumulated on the roof, and it made a sound like a long, slow breath. "I understand that difference," he said. "Alina's family wanted her to go north with them after the homestead was settled. She could have had a smaller life. She chose this instead. And you," Hazel said, "you could have sold this ranch after, gone back to Texas or wherever you started. A lot of men would have." "I know," he said. "I thought about it. For about 3 weeks the previous November, I thought very seriously about it. And then I went out one morning and looked at this land, and I realized that what Alina had loved about this place was not me. It was this. The land, the sky, the cattle, the whole enormous reality of it. And if I left, I would be taking myself out of the only place she had ever chosen to love. That seemed like a betrayal of something I did not know how to name." Hazel set down her sewing. She looked at him across the parlor, this man with the dark eyes and the gray at his temples and the careful hands, sitting in the lamplight with Shakespeare open on his knee and his whole complicated heart showing itself to her. And she thought, "I am in serious trouble, and I am no longer certain I want to be saved from it." "Gideon," she said. He looked up. "I would like you to know," she said, choosing each word with the precision of someone who has decided honesty is worth the exposure it costs, "that I came here for a job and I have found something I was not expecting. I am not asking you anything. I am simply telling you because I think you deserve to know, and because I think not saying the true thing is always more destructive in the long run than saying it." He was very still. "I have found myself caring about this house," she said, and about the person in it. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full. It was the kind of silence that has all the weight of an answer without yet being one. He closed the book on his knee. He set it on the side table. He looked at her with those dark eyes in which something was working its way to the surface, with the patient inevitability of spring water finding its way through stone. "I do not know how to do this," he said. "I want to be honest with you about that. I know how to run a ranch. I know how to read land and weather and cattle. I know how to be a husband. I learned how, but I learned with a leaner, and she was." He stopped. "She was particular, and she shaped me in particular ways. I don't know if what I am, what I have become, is something that would suit someone who is not a leaner." "I am not looking to be a leaner," Hazel said. "I know that," he said. "That is not what I meant. I meant." He stood up from his chair, and then he seemed to realize he did not know quite where he was going, and he stopped in the middle of the room. "I meant that I am afraid," he said, "of doing this wrong. Of you being alone again because I did not know how to be enough." Hazel stood up too. She walked to the middle of the room and stopped in front of him, and she looked up at him, and she said, "Gideon Maddox, you have spent 3 years in a house with someone's absence, maintaining her mark in your Hearthstone and her presence in your habits, and you have done that with enough integrity that the house itself has not forgotten her. That is not the behavior of a man who does not know how to love someone adequately." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached out and took her hand, just her hand, formal and tentative as a first step on uncertain ice. His palm was warm and rough, and she felt the contact in her whole chest. "I do not want to rush this," he said. "I want to do this right. I think you deserve that. Proper courtship, time. I want you to be sure." "I have been sure of very little in my life," Hazel said. "I find I am rather sure about this." He let out a long breath. His grip on her hand shifted, became something less tentative. "Then we will find our way," he said. Christmas came to the Maddox Ranch with the particular beauty that Wyoming winter landscapes offered, which was the brutal and indifferent beauty of a place that would kill you without malice if you underestimated it, but was glorious to inhabit from the safety of warmth and shelter. Hazel decorated the house with pine boughs she had cut from the tree line at the edge of the northern pasture, and she baked a plum pudding that required 3 days of preparation and turned out better than she had expected. And on Christmas morning, she found a small package on the kitchen table with her name on it in Gideon's straight, square handwriting. Inside was a copy of a book of Emily Dickinson's poetry. The binding was red and the edges of the pages were gilt, and on the inside cover he had written simply, "For someone who is not afraid of the true thing." GM, she held the book for a long time. He came in from the barn and found her standing at the kitchen table with it pressed to her chest, and she was not crying, but she was close, and he looked at her with an expression that contained something she had started to recognize as the particular way he looked at things he valued, quiet and steady and without performance. "It is the most thoughtful gift I have ever received," she said. "You told me in November that you thought she was underestimated as a poet," he said. "I had not read her." "I read her. You were right." She had given him a pair of good wool gloves she had knitted herself, dark green, and a small framed silhouette of 2 horses she had found in a shop in Cutter's Creek during a supply trip in early December. He held the gloves and looked at the silhouette and said that a leaner had always wanted horses on the walls and he had never gotten around to it. "Then she would be pleased," Hazel said. "Yes," he agreed. "I think she would be." They had Christmas dinner at the kitchen table with 3 of the hands who had no family to go to, Cal Denton and 2 older men named Rooney and Marsh, and the table was loud and warm, and the plum pudding received genuine acclaim, and Gideon sat at the head of the table with something on his face that Hazel had not seen there before in their 6 weeks of midday meals and evening conversations. Not just contentment, not just relief. Something larger than both. The expression of a man who has been afraid that certain things were behind him and is discovering that he was wrong. January was the hardest month on the ranch, as January in Wyoming territory tended to be. A second major storm in the first week of the year trapped everyone on the property for 5 days and tested reserves of both physical supplies and human patience. Hazel managed the household supplies with a methodical competence that Gideon watched with open appreciation, and she organized the cooking in a way that kept the hands fed adequately without depleting the stores they would need through February. On the fifth day, when the storm broke and the temperature was still below zero but the wind had dropped, she stood on the front porch and looked at the white landscape under the blue sky and felt, for the first time since she had left Cincinnati, something she could only describe as right, as being in the right place. Gideon came out behind her and stood beside her, close enough that their shoulders almost touched, both of them looking at the land. "When I first saw this country, I thought it was impossible," she said. "Too large, too indifferent. I could not understand what anyone saw in a place that seemed so willing to kill you. And now," he said. "Now I understand that the indifference is not personal," she said. "It is simply what the land is. You are not small to it, you are just not its primary concern. There is a kind of freedom in that." He turned his head and looked at her profile. "You have adapted to this place faster than anyone I have ever watched come here," he said. "Alina grew up in this country, she already knew it. But the people who come from back east, they usually spend a year fighting the land before they stop fighting it. I am accustomed to being somewhere that does not particularly care whether I thrive," she said. It came out drier than she intended, and she heard him make a sound that was a genuine laugh, brief and low, and it hit her somewhere important. "That," he said, "is going to change." She looked at him then, and he was looking at her, and the space between them had become the kind of space that has a character of its own, charged with everything that has been said and everything that is still building toward being said. He kissed her. Right there on the porch in the frozen aftermath of the blizzard, with the temperature still brutal, and the sky impossibly blue above the white fields. He turned toward her and put one gloved hand against her face with a gentleness that was astonishing in a man of his size and physical capability, and he kissed her, careful and warm and honest. She kissed him back. She put both her hands against his chest, and she kissed him back with the full force of 6 weeks of careful restraint dissolving all at once. They stood on the porch for a long moment. His forehead dropped to rest against hers, and they both stood there breathing cold air into the space between them. "I have been wanting to do that since the storm in November," he said. "I know," she said. "You knew. You looked at me differently after that evening," she said. "And I watch people carefully." He laughed again, and this time it was longer and fuller, and it rang out across the white yard and startled a crow from the fence post at the edge of the porch. And the crow flew up and away across the snow with its black wings catching the winter light. February brought a different kind of challenge, the kind that is human rather than meteorological. Gideon rode into Cutter's Creek on a Wednesday to pick up supplies and came back with a look on his face that she had not seen before, a tight, controlled anger riding just below the surface of his composed expression. He told her at dinner. There was a man named Hartwell, Cyrus Hartwell, who had arrived in the area in the autumn and had spent the winter positioning himself as a major land consolidator, buying up struggling homesteads and smaller ranches for prices that were insultingly below market value, and using a combination of legal pressure and the suggestion of less legal pressure to accomplish this. Cutter's Creek had been buzzing with it all winter. She had heard fragments. What she had not heard, because he had not told her, was that Hartwell had his eye on the southern portion of Gideon's land, a particularly water-rich stretch where the creek ran strongest. "He made an offer again," Gideon said. "Third time. This one came with a specific suggestion that if I continued to decline, certain things about the contested water rights on my eastern boundary might become legal problems." "That is a threat," Hazel said flatly. "Yes," he said, "it is." "What are you going to do?" He looked at her across the table with those dark, serious eyes. "I am going to hire a lawyer in Cheyenne and document the eastern boundary rights thoroughly enough that there is no legal angle for him to use, and I am going to do it quickly." "That takes money," she said. "I have money," he said. "The ranch has been profitable for 3 years running. I am not a man Cyrus Hartwell can squeeze out." "What about the smaller ranchers, the ones he has been approaching?" Gideon was quiet for a moment. "There are 4 families in this county that I know of who are in real trouble," he said. "The Petersons, the Greer family, the 2 homesteading families on the East Fork. Hartwell is moving on them all. Can you help them?" He looked at her. "That is a larger question than it sounds." "I know," she said, "but can you?" He was quiet for another moment, and she could see him thinking through something, working through it the way he worked through problems methodically from the foundation up. "I cannot buy their land back for them," he said. "I cannot fight Hartwell's lawyers for 4 separate families at the same time without resources I don't have. But I might be able to do something more useful than that." He paused. "There is a territorial land commissioner who will be in Cheyenne next month. If I can get enough documentation together, enough evidence of Hartwell's pattern of coercive acquisition, I might be able to bring a case at the territorial level. That has broader reach than any one family's individual fight. Who else would need to be involved? Other ranchers, established families who Hartwell has not yet targeted but who would be next if he consolidates what he is already going after." He looked at her with something that was starting to look like collaboration, genuine collaborative thinking as between 2 people working on the same problem. "I would need to hold a meeting, get people in a room together, that kind of thing." "I can help with that," Hazel said. "I know more of the families in this county than you might think. I have been going into town for supplies. People talk to me." He looked at her for a long moment. "Hazel," he said, "you are remarkably useful." "I am aware," she said. "It took people a long time to notice." The meeting happened in the 3rd week of February, held at the Maddox Ranch. 12 families crowded into the parlor and the kitchen, and spilling into the hall. Hazel organized the food and the logistics, which sounds like a domestic contribution but was actually a complicated social and organizational undertaking, making sure every family felt welcomed, making sure the tensions between certain neighbors who had their own minor disputes were managed, making sure the agenda that Gideon had outlined was actually followed rather than collapsing into the kind of loud, disorganized complaint session that accomplishes nothing. She watched him work the room. She had not seen him in a public and leadership capacity before, and it was a revelation. He was not a man who craved attention or performed authority. He simply had clarity, and he communicated it in a way that cut through noise and fear and made people feel like they were standing on solid ground rather than sinking. He laid out the situation with facts rather than anger. He outlined what he proposed to do. He asked specific things of specific people, documentation here, testimony there, witness to that transaction. By the end of the evening, he had a working coalition. She walked the last guests out and came back to find him sitting at the kitchen table with a pen and paper, already organizing the information he had gathered. She made coffee and set a cup at his elbow, and he reached up without looking and took her hand briefly, just briefly, a gesture so natural and unconscious that it stopped her breath for a moment. "Good evening's work," she said. "With a great deal of help," he said, and looked up at her. "Thomas Briggs told me tonight that he has never seen a gathering at the Maddox Ranch where anyone went home feeling full and organized at the same time. I believe that is a comment about your cooking and your abilities in equal measure." "Thomas Briggs is a sensible man," she said. "The legal fight with Hartwell consumed March and April. Gideon made 2 trips to Cheyenne, each of several days, and Hazel managed the ranch in his absence with the assistance of the hands, which went more smoothly than anyone expected, partly because she had spent 4 months learning the rhythms of this place well enough to anticipate its needs, and partly because Cal Denton, the youngest of the hands, turned out to be a more capable lieutenant than his cheerful demeanor suggested. She wrote to Gideon in Cheyenne, and he wrote back, letters that began practically and became, over the course of the exchange, something more personal, more revealing. The kind of letters that happen when two people are separated and stop managing their expression quite so carefully. He told her, in a letter that arrived on a Thursday in late March, that he had spent his first evening in Cheyenne in the hotel room reading her letters, and had realized that the feeling he had when he picked up one of her envelopes was a feeling he had thought was part of a life he had already finished living, that he was grateful for being wrong. She wrote back that she had found, in his absence, that she did not simply miss his presence as one misses a pleasant thing in one's daily life, but that she missed being able to turn and say something to him, that all the interesting things that happened during the day built up against the absence of him to say them to, and made her acutely aware of how thoroughly she had reorganized her inner life around the expectation of him listening. These were not small things to say. Both of them understood that. He came back from Cheyenne in the first week of April with the information that the Territorial Land Commissioner had agreed to investigate Hartwell's acquisition methods, that two of the families who had already sold under pressure had recourse to challenge those sales, and that Cyrus Hartwell's activities in Cutter's Creek were about to become considerably more complicated than he had anticipated. It was not a complete victory. These things rarely were, and it would take months more to fully resolve, but the immediate pressure had been released, and the smallest families had been given breathing room. He walked into the kitchen on a Tuesday evening, and she turned from the stove, and he was there, trail dusty and tired, and carrying something in his expression that she read immediately as good news and relief. And she set down her spoon, and he crossed the room and took her face in his hands and kissed her like a man who has been away longer than he wanted to be and has had time to understand what waiting feels like. "Well," she said, when he let her breathe. "Well," he said, "Hartwell is going to have a difficult spring." She laughed, and he kissed her again, briefer this time but no less genuine, and then he sat down and she fed him dinner, and he told her everything in the methodical way he had, and she listened and asked the specific questions that showed she had understood the situation from the beginning, and he watched her face across the table with an expression that by this point in their acquaintance she could read with some fluency. It was the expression of a man who has found something he did not know how to ask for. May arrived, and the land came back to life with the urgent productivity of a Wyoming spring, green pushing up through the brown where the snow had been, the creek running high and cold with snowmelt, the cattle moving with new energy in the lower pastures. The ranch hands were busy from first light to last dark, and the barn was full of activity, and the kitchen was at its most useful capacity all day long. On a Saturday in mid-May, Gideon came into the kitchen in the middle of the morning and asked her to walk with him. She took off her apron and she walked with him, out through the yard and along the creek path that ran south along the water toward the cottonwood grove where the creek made a bend. The cottonwoods were fully leafed out, the new leaves that particular luminous green of spring, and the water was loud and bright below them. He stopped at the bend. He had his hands in his pockets, which was unusual for him, a man who generally used his hands to carry or build or hold things. He looked at the water for a moment and then he turned to her. "I need to ask you something," he said, "and I need to preface it with being honest about what I am and what I am not." "All right," she said. "I am a rancher in Wyoming territory," he said. "I have a good ranch, and it will be better as the years go on if I continue to manage it well, which I intend to. I am not a young man. I am 35 years old. I have buried a wife, and I carry that with me in ways that are not always visible but are permanent. I am not always easy to be with. I have habits of silence and privacy that are deeply built in. I am better than I was at reaching across that, but I cannot promise I will never retreat into it." She was very still, watching him. "I can promise," he said, "that I will never keep secrets from you again. That the things that belong to the history of this house will always be yours to know if you want to know them. That your life here will be genuinely yours, not a position you occupy, not a kindness I offer, but a genuine equal life in this place. I can promise that I am in love with you, that this is not a comfortable feeling of companionship grown warm over winter, but something that has the quality of a thing I would choose to build on, something I want to put a permanent mark on." He stopped. He looked at her with those dark, earnest eyes, entirely without performance, entirely without the careful containment she had arrived to find. He had taken all of it down. "Hazel Wallace," he said, "would you be willing to marry me?" She looked at him for a long moment. The creek ran cold and bright beside them. The cottonwood leaves turned in the light breeze off the mountains. A hawk was doing long, slow circles in the blue above the cottonwoods, patient and unhurried. "Yes," she said, "I would be willing to marry you. I would be more than willing. I would be genuinely glad." He took her hand from his pocket in that moment, and she realized he had been holding something in it. A ring. A simple gold band with a small garnet set in it, deep red as the inside of a rose. He slid it onto her finger with the careful exactness that was characteristic of everything he did. "It was not a Leaner's," he said. "I had it made in Cheyenne. I want you to know that." She looked at the ring on her finger and then up at his face. "Thank you," she said, "for that thought." "I have been thinking about it since January," he confessed. "The ring has been in my coat pocket for 6 weeks." "6 weeks," she said. "I wanted to be sure the timing was right," he said. "And that Hartwell was dealt with sufficiently, that I was not asking you to take on a legal fight as a wedding gift." She laughed, and he smiled, and he pulled her to him with the creek bright beside them and the hawk still circling, and the Wyoming spring in full impractical beauty all around. They were married in June of 1883. The ceremony was at the Methodist Church in Cutter's Creek, the same church where Gideon and Alina had married 6 years before, and Hazel made her peace with that symmetry, understood it as a fact of a life rather than a defeat, because a church does not belong to grief, and a town does not belong to one story. She wore a dress of pale blue broadcloth that she had made herself over the preceding weeks, and she carried a small bouquet of wild columbines that Cal Denton had ridden out at first light to gather from the slopes above the creek. Thomas Briggs gave her away, since she had no family present, and he did it with such sincere dignity that she had to work hard to keep her expression steady. The hands all attended, scrubbed and uncomfortable in their good shirts, and the Greer family came, and the Petersons, and a dozen other families from the county who had got to know Hazel over the winter, as the woman behind the Maddox ranch's hospitality and Gideon's surprising new friendliness at county gatherings. The reception was held in the yard of the ranch, which was warm and clear in the June sunshine, and Hazel had spent a week preparing food with the assistance of Mrs. Peterson, who turned out to be an extraordinary baker, and the table held more food than 20 people could reasonably eat, and everyone ate unreasonably, and there was music from a fiddle played by one of the hands named Dorsey, who had hidden this talent until now. Gideon danced with her. He was not a natural dancer. He moved with a careful precision that was more about effort than ease, but he held her with the complete attentiveness he brought to everything, and she did not care about the grace, only about the reality of his arms around her in the middle of the yard with the afternoon light long and golden, and the mountains blue behind the ranch house. "Are you happy?" he asked quietly against her hair. "More than I have words for," she said, "and I generally have words for things." "I know," he said. "That is one of the things I love about you." Summer settled over the Maddox ranch with its particular abundance. The cattle were fat and the hay crop was strong, and the ongoing legal pressure on Cyrus Hartwell had produced results, 2 of his coercive land deals having been voided by territorial order, and Hartwell himself having departed the county in May for unknown destinations, which was a relief that was quietly celebrated at the general store by Thomas Briggs breaking out a bottle he kept for special occasions. Hazel reorganized the house in ways that were respectful and careful and gradual. She moved certain things, found places for them that were better suited. She added her own books to the shelves in the parlor, her Dickinson beside his Shakespeare. She put her mother's small oil lamp on the kitchen windowsill where the evening light hit it. She hung a painting she had owned since Cincinnati on the wall of the upstairs hallway, a landscape of very green hills that looked nothing like Wyoming, but reminded her of her mother's description of Ireland, which her mother had never seen, but which her mother's mother had crossed from. She did not move anything that was Eleanor's. What remained of Eleanor's presence in the house had been curated by Gideon into things he had kept and things he had let go, and what he had kept she treated with the same quiet respect she had offered the Hearthstone. She went to the Hearthstone one morning in August, the house quiet, Gideon out with the cattle. She looked at the initials for a long time. GM and EM. She went to the kitchen and got the small knife she used for precise cutting. She came back. She crouched down on the floor next to the hearthstone, in the same position where she had been when she first found those letters, and she pressed the blade carefully into the stone. It was harder than she expected. The stone was dense and old, but she was patient and she was precise, and she had been watching how things were done carefully for long enough to know that difficult things can be accomplished by someone willing to take the necessary time. When Gideon came in for dinner, she was at the stove and she said nothing, and he washed and sat at the table, and he said nothing either, though she noticed him look toward the hearth and then look back without comment. After dinner, she said, "Come look at the hearthstone." He came and stood beside her and looked down. She watched his face. Beside GM and EM, in letters less deep but cleanly cut, were the new initials, HM, not replacing, not erasing. Beside, all three sets of initials in the stone now, permanent, belonging, each one telling its own true part of the story of this house. He looked at it for a long time. She waited. When he looked up, his eyes were full, not spilling but full, and he took her face in both hands with the same gentleness he had shown on the porch in the January cold all those months ago, and he kissed her forehead and held her there, and she felt his chest expand with a breath that sounded like something releasing, some last held thing finally given permission to go. "Eleanor would have liked you enormously," he said, his voice low and certain. "She would have called you a woman with sense." "High praise," Hazel said. "From Eleanor, the highest," he said. "She had very little patience with anyone who lacked it." Hazel put her arms around him and they stood at the hearthstone together, and the fire she had built that morning was still burning low in the grate, and the three sets of initials were below them in the stone, settled and permanent and part of this house now. The full story of it, not one story replaced by another, but all the stories accumulated in the way that lives accumulate, each one adding to what came before without erasing it. September brought a piece of news that hit Hazel on a morning when she was in the kitchen, and resulted in her standing very still for approximately 3 minutes with her hand on the counter, organizing her understanding of it. She was with child. She told Gideon that evening. She had been thinking all day about how to say it, and in the end she said it plainly because she had learned that plain was the way this man received truth best, and also because she was too full of feeling to manage anything complicated. "I am going to have a baby," she said, "sometime in April if my calculation is right." He was at the kitchen table with his ledger book open, and he set down his pen and looked at her across the table with an expression that took several seconds to settle into something she could fully read. And when it settled, she saw the whole of him in it, the part that was afraid, the part that was joyful, the part that knew how to hold both at once because he had lived long enough to understand that they were not mutually exclusive. He stood up and came around the table and took her hands. "Are you all right?" he said. "I am very well," she said. "I am also experiencing a number of feelings simultaneously which I have not finished sorting." "We can sort them together," he said. "Yes," she said, "that is what I was thinking." He held her hands and looked at her with all that complicated luminous feeling showing on his face. "I am going to do this right," he said. "I want you to know that, whatever it requires." "I know," she said, and she did. The autumn was warm, and the ranch prospered, and Hazel grew in the particular way that women grow when they are carrying something new into the world. Not the diminished way that fear makes of it, but the full expanding way that happens when a woman knows she is where she belongs. She was tired some days and vigorous others, and she managed the house with adjustments, and Gideon managed the adjustments with a matter-of-fact attentiveness that she found, consistently, deeply moving. He did not treat her as fragile. He treated her as someone who knew her own body and her own capacity better than he did, which she did, and he offered help when she asked for it and stayed out of her way when she did not, which was precisely right. In the evenings, he read to her from whatever book they were working through, because she was often tired enough in the later months to find reading herself effortful, and she lay on the settee in the parlor with her feet up and the fire going and listened to his voice move through history and poetry, and the occasional adventure novel that Cal Denton had lent them with shy enthusiasm. His voice was good for reading, steady and clear, with the occasional dry inflection that told her he had noticed something amusing without stopping to make a production of it. Winter came and the ranch pulled in on itself in its winter way, and Hazel spent December and January doing more interior work, the sewing and preserving and organizational projects that the cold months made possible, and she knitted small things, soft things, the functional preparations that have the quality of prayer because they are made in anticipation of something that has not yet happened but that you are making space for, that you are calling toward you with your hands. Gideon sat with her many of those evenings and occasionally picked up the knitting needles at her instruction and made limited but sincere efforts that produced lopsided rectangles of wool that she accepted with complete seriousness. And the laughter between them over these efforts was the easy laughter of two people who have settled into each other, who know the landscape of each other well enough to move through it without anxiety. On the 17th of April, 1884, after a long night and a difficult morning, and the assistance of the doctor brought from Cutter's Creek, a boy was born in the bedroom of the Maddox ranch house. He arrived loud and determined, and with a head of dark hair that Gideon looked at with an expression of combined astonishment and helplessness that was perhaps the most undefended Hazel had ever seen him. She held the baby and she was exhausted and present in the way that extreme effort makes you present, reduced to the essential, and she looked at this small, loud, determined person, and she felt a love that was different from any love she had felt before. Not better or worse than the love she felt for Gideon, but different in kind. A love with no history, no caution, no careful building, just an immediate and total fact. "He is very loud," Gideon said, sitting on the edge of the bed beside her with his large, careful hands clasped together as if he was afraid to move them. "He clearly has opinions," Hazel said. "Already. He comes by it honestly," she said. Gideon looked at her sidelong with those dark eyes, and the corner of his mouth moved in a way she loved. "Which side of the family," he said, "do you believe he inherits that from?" "I would not venture to speculate," she said. "They named him James Wallace Maddox." James for Hazel's father, Wallace for her family name, Maddox because he was built of this land and this house, and the complicated and rich history of the man who held him for the first time that evening, with the careful reverence of someone who has been given something he was afraid to hope for. The ranch hands, when word got to them the following morning, produced a celebration that involved considerable noise and a cake that Dorsey somehow organized, and Cal Denton stood in the yard below the bedroom window and shouted congratulations with such genuine joy that Hazel could hear him from her bed, and she laughed until she was sore. The years that followed were the years of building. Not the anxious building of a man working to fill a life depleted by loss, but the confident building of two people who know what they want and have the capability and will to pursue it. The ranch grew. Gideon expanded the herd carefully, purchased additional land when the opportunity came, negotiated a good contract with one of the rail depots in Cheyenne for his beef. The legal situation in the county stabilized, the Hartwell episode having frightened enough people into proper documentation of their land rights that future attempts at coercive consolidation would be significantly harder. Hazel became, in the years following her marriage, something that she had not anticipated but that felt, in retrospect, entirely logical. She became a person the county knew, not as an adjunct to Gideon, though she was certainly connected to him, but in her own right, as someone with a clear mind and a willingness to engage with problems. When the question of a school for the county's children became urgent, she was one of the small group who organized the effort, wrote the petition to the territorial government, and coordinated the fundraising that built the schoolhouse 2 miles north of Cutter's Creek in 1886. When the town needed a lending library, she was the one who spent a winter writing letters to publishers and distant relatives, and anyone else she could think of, until she had enough books to fill 3 shelves in the back of Thomas Briggs's general store, which was where the library lived for several years before acquiring its own modest building. She was capable and discreet. But she was also capable and present, capable and vocal when that was what was needed, capable and willing to argue when the argument mattered. And Gideon watched all of this with the quiet, steady pride of someone who is gratified, not surprised, to find that what they already knew about a person is being confirmed on an expanding scale. James was 4 years old and full of opinions, and running everywhere when Hazel told Gideon she was pregnant again. This time he received the news with less of the complicated fear and more of the pure joy, and he held her for a long moment in the kitchen before breakfast, while James watched from the doorway with the concentrated interest of a small person, unsure whether this adult behavior requires his intervention. The second child was a girl, born in May of 1888, and they named her Clara after no one in particular, just because it sounded like what she looked like when she arrived, which was, according to Gideon, like she had been here before, and was faintly impatient about having to explain herself again. Clara was nothing like her brother in temperament, where James was loud and direct. Clara was watchful and precise, a 4-year-old who noticed things that most adults missed, and who communicated these observations with a seriousness that made adults feel faintly assessed. She was, Hazel thought privately, very much her father's daughter. The Hearthstone was cleaned in the summer of 1888 by James Wallace Maddox, 4 years old, who had found a brush and taken it upon himself to scrub the floor around the fireplace with the zeal of a very small person who has recently learned that cleaning is a thing that happens. Hazel found him crouched over it with total concentration, and she crouched beside him, and he showed her the initials with the proprietary pride of discovery. "Letters," he said. "Yes," she said. "G for Gideon," he said, because he was learning his letters with the determination he brought to everything. "M for Maddox." "That is right," she said. He looked at the next set with a small frown of concentration. "E.M., he said. "Eleanor Maddox," Hazel said. "She lived in this house before us." "She was the one who put those letters there." He thought about this. "Is she gone now?" "She is," Hazel said. "But her letters stayed," he said. "Yes," Hazel said. "Her letters stayed." He looked at the third set. "H for Hazel," he said. "H.M., Hazel Maddox," she confirmed. He studied all 3 sets with the thoroughness of a 4-year-old conducting an official investigation. Then he stood up and went to the kitchen and came back with a piece of chalk he had been using to practice his letters on the slate board. "James," Hazel said, watching him with a suspicion she recognized as warranted. "There should be more letters," he said with 4-year-old certainty. "J for James." "James," she said, "you cannot put chalk on the hearthstone." He considered this with the particular expression he had inherited from his father, the expression of a person making an internal recalculation. "When I am bigger," he said, "can I make real letters?" She looked at her son standing at the hearthstone with his piece of chalk and his dark eyes and his complete seriousness, and she thought about the woman who had pressed a chisel into this stone 35 years from now in this boy's memory, making sure the house knew who lived in it. "When you are bigger," she said, "we will do it together." She found Gideon on the porch that evening, sitting in the chair he had acquired the previous winter, a good solid piece of furniture built by Rooney, who had turned out to have a talent for carpentry that he had also been hiding, until someone provided him with the materials and the opportunity. The sky was going orange and purple over the mountains, and the cattle were moving in the lower pasture, with the slow deliberateness of animals settled for the evening. And Clara was asleep inside, and James was theoretically in bed, and Gideon was looking at the sky with that expression he had when he was content, which was not the wide, demonstrative expression that content sometimes produces in people, but was simply a loosening, a letting down of the structure he usually maintained. The way a house looks when all its windows are lit from within. She sat in the chair beside him, and he reached over without looking and took her hand. James wants to carve his initials in the hearthstone, she said. She felt Gideon turn to look at her. She kept looking at the orange sky. Did he? Gideon said. He said there should be more letters, she said. He is not wrong. A pause. We should wait until he can hold a chisel properly, Gideon said. That was my thought, she said. Another pause. Clara will want hers eventually too, he said. Obviously, she said. He settled back in his chair, and she felt his thumb move across her knuckles in the absent way of someone who is not thinking about the gesture but who cannot help making it. The sky deepened toward purple. A nighthawk called from somewhere along the creek, that long descending cry it makes in the last of the light. This is a good life, he said. She squeezed his hand. Yes, she said. It is. Better than I knew to want, he said. She turned to look at him then, this man she had come to through a canvas trunk and an advertisement and a hearthstone that refused to stay secret. He was 39 years old, and the gray at his temples had spread further, and the lines at the corners of his eyes were deeper, and he was more himself than anyone she had ever known, more entirely and consistently himself in a way that was a kind of fidelity all its own, a fidelity to his own nature that meant you always knew who you were dealing with and could trust that it would not change on you. I love you, she said. She said it simply and directly, as she said most important things. He looked at her with those dark eyes in the fading light, and what she saw there was the complete addition of everything he was, the rancher, the widower, the man who had spent 3 years alone with an absence, the man who had kept a chisel mark clean in the hope that it meant what he thought it meant about the kind of person he was, the man who had told her everything, finally, when the hearthstone made it impossible to tell her nothing. The man who had said, I am afraid, which was perhaps the bravest thing he had ever said. You are, he said, the best thing this ranch has ever held. That, she said, is a very high bar given what this ranch has held. I mean it, he said. Both things. Eleanor was extraordinary, and you are extraordinary, and both of those things are true simultaneously, and I no longer find them in conflict. She felt those words settle in her chest like something warm and structural, like the last stone laid in a foundation, the thing that makes everything built on top of it finally stable. Neither do I, she said. They sat on the porch until the stars came out, which in Wyoming territory meant until the sky was crowded with them. The Milky Way spread across the dark overhead in its extravagant abundance, and the mountains black against the starlight, and the ranch below them breathing in its sleep, the cattle and the horses and the barns and the cottonwoods along the creek, and the house behind them with its 2 sleeping children and its lamp still burning in the kitchen window, warm and steady, keeping faith with whoever was out in the dark and needed to know where home was. The hearthstone sat in the center of the house, as it always had. 3 sets of initials in the lower left corner, worn smooth at the edges by years of firelight and the occasional curious hand running over them. GM and EM for Eleanor, who had put a chisel to the stone and said we lived here. HM for Hazel, who had crouched on the floor beside a scrub brush and found a secret, and decided that the right response to a secret was not to fill it in with mortar and move forward but to make room for it, to carve her own mark beside it and say yes, and also. There was space in the stone, to the right of HM, enough for 2 more sets of letters. Hazel had noticed this when she made her own mark. Had noticed it and left it deliberately, because she had learned from the woman who started this tradition that a hearthstone is not a finished thing. It is an ongoing record, a house's slow account of all the people who have called it home. James Wallace Maddox would be 8 years old in the spring. In the spring, when he could hold a chisel properly, Hazel thought they might have a small ceremony about it. Something that acknowledged what it meant to add your mark to this stone. Something that told him about a leaner, in more detail than a 4-year-old could hold, the full story of her. The fearless homesteader's daughter who had walked into this house with her father and looked around for what needed to be done. Who had married a careful, serious rancher who loved her and watched her die with a grief he had not known how to put down. Who had left him a letter asking him not to be alone. Who had carved her mark in this stone and trusted the house to tell its own story eventually. The house had told it, and the story was not finished. That was the thing about Hearthstones. They lasted longer than any particular sorrow or joy. They held everything given to them and kept it faithfully, and year by year the initials worn smooth by firelight became less a record of loss and more a record of love, which is, in the end, the only record worth keeping. Hazel Maddox sat on her porch under the Wyoming stars with her husband's hand in hers, and she thought that if Alina had been standing there watching, she would not have found it sad. She would have found it right. She would have said, in the direct and practical way she apparently had of saying things, good. That is what a house is for. And Hazel thought, yes, that is exactly what a house is for. Gideon said much later, after the stars had wheeled far enough that it was properly night, "We should go in." "We should," she agreed. Neither of them moved for another several minutes. The nighthawk called again, further off now, its cry moving away along the creek into the dark. Then they went in. The door closed behind them. The lamp in the kitchen window burned on, as it always did, keeping faith, keeping watch, holding the light for anyone who needed to know that this house was lived in, that this house was full, that this house was home to people who had found each other by way of a Hearthstone's patient secret and had decided together to stay. The summer James turned 8, they did have the ceremony. A small thing, just the family, the 4 of them together on the floor next to the hearthstone on a Saturday morning, Gideon with a proper carving chisel and James with his tongue pressed to his lip in concentration, and Clara watching from approximately 4 inches away with her father's intense evaluative attention. Gideon showed James how to hold the chisel, how to apply pressure evenly, how to work with the stone rather than against it. James carved, slow and careful and exactly himself. Clara demanded her turn. She carved, more quickly than her brother had, with the confidence of a 6-year-old who has determined that if it can be done it might as well be done efficiently. Gideon sat back on his heels and looked at the hearthstone. 5 sets of initials now, the whole family account, from Alina's original mark through to Clara's fresh cuts in the stone. "Good," he said, with the profound simplicity of a man who has learned that some things do not require elaboration. James looked at all 5. "We need to tell everyone who they all are," he said, with the seriousness of a family historian newly appointed to the role. "Yes," Hazel said, "we do." So they sat together on the floor next to the hearthstone, all 4 of them, and Gideon and Hazel told the story. Alina's story and their own story, and how the house had kept both stories safe in the stone until it was time for them to be told. They told it in the way that important stories get told when you want them to last, which is plainly and completely and without leaving out the difficult parts, because the difficult parts are where the real meaning lies. James listened, with the same complete attention his mother had always brought to things worth hearing. Clara listened with the particular quality of stillness that she had inherited from her father, the stillness of someone absorbing something down to the foundation. And the fire burned in the grate above the hearthstone, and the Wyoming afternoon light came through the windows at its long October angle, and outside the land stretched away in every direction under a sky of such deep and indifferent blue that it made the heart ache with the pleasure of being alive to see it. Inside, the initials stayed in the stone. GM and EM and HM and JM and CM, permanent as love that is given enough time and intention to press itself into something that will outlast the moment that made it. This was the Maddox Ranch, 1892, and these were the people who lived in it, and the house knew them all by name.